Hello, thanks for joining us for our latest episode of Elements Connected Technology Talks podcast. My name is Alex Toohie, Technical Solution Manager with Elements Connected Technologies UK division, and I'm joined today by Mustanir Ali, who is our Head of Product Cyber Assurance. Today we're going to talk through a few different topics related to cybersecurity. So we'll look at what we know about the Radio Equipment Directive so far, the PSTI regime in the UK, and then we'll look at other legislation like the Cyber Resilience Act, and maybe look a bit further afield to what some other countries are doing as well. So thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. So I think we'll start with the PSTI regime, which is the first one that came into effect sort of globally in the UK. So it's been nearly 2 years since that came into effect in the UK. I mean, what do we know so far?
So 2 years, and this was a piece of legislation which was received. Manufacturers didn't receive this particularly thoroughly, I guess we can say at the time. It was brought in quite quickly. I think it was September 2023 that the actual rules were published, and then April 24 when this became law. It was mandatory. So not a huge amount of time. You know, when we look at things like the Radio Equipment Directive and CRA, we've had years to prepare for these, whereas PSTI was brought in very quickly. That said, the technical requirements, what manufacturers actually have to do to comply with PSTI, is relatively easy to meet. There are 4 requirements under PSTI. One of these is about not having default passwords on the products. One is on vulnerability reporting procedures. One is on having update periods published. And the fourth one is having a statement of compliance which accompanies the product. So when we compare that to things like RED and CRA, there's a lot less that manufacturers have to do actually to meet those requirements. That said, because it was brought in quickly, a lot of manufacturers simply weren't aware or didn't have the time to prepare, or there were products already in the distribution chain which could have been affected. And that's the other thing to talk about with PSTI, is that it didn't just affect products as they came off the production line, it was products in the distribution chain as well. So what we've seen is actually a lot of products that are placed on the market, even as recently as the last few months, haven't been in conformity, either because manufacturers weren't aware or just hadn't had time to address the requirements. Speaking to the OPSS, so that's the regulator who would enforce the PSTI, they've checked dozens of products throughout 2025, and I think as many as about 75% of those have had non-conformities. Now, most of those non-conformities were related to documentation rather than anything technical in the product itself. But it's still quite staggering, really, that 3/4 of products in 2025, when the legislation was published or became mandatory in 2024, still had those errors. Now, that said, the OPSS have been quite pragmatic about this. They've not taken any enforcement action against any of these manufacturers. At this point, it's still just a case of telling manufacturers what the problem is and how to fix it. But I think reading between the lines, we can expect that certainly from 2026 onwards, the market surveillance body, OPSS, will start taking more strict action, should we say, against manufacturers whose products are still not in conformity, because they've had 2 years now to get used to it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Moving on to sort of over in sort of Europe then, with the Radio Equipment Directive, which is the latest sort of piece of legislation that's come into effect with cybersecurity requirements for radio equipment, coming into effect basically from August 2025. So that's here. What do we know with how that's landed?
It is here, yeah. The 1st of August 2025 was a very busy and confusing day, I think, for a lot of people. There was a huge amount of ambiguity at the time over what products were actually in scope, particularly the definition of what an internet-connected product is. And that's still something which there isn't agreement on across the industry. At the point of us recording this, we have a draft RED guide. So this is a document that was released by the Commission to give guidance to manufacturers on how to interpret the text of the RED. It doesn't replace the legal text, but it gives that guidance and support. In there we do have some examples of what is internet connected, what is not internet connected, but it's still not crystal clear at this point. That guide is just in draft. So there's still some way to go, I think, before we know categorically which types of products are covered and which ones are not. The standards the harmonised standards that manufacturers had used for assessment against RED, the EN 18031 series, they've been published for quite some time now, been harmonised since early in 2025. But those standards are very, very different to, if we look at, say, an EMC standard or a radio product standard that manufacturers will be familiar with, the structure of 18031 is very, very different. It breaks things down into a conceptual assessment and a functional assessment. An awful lot of documentation needs to be gathered, and that's one of the areas that manufacturers have struggled with, I think, because of all of the documentation that's needed and because of how different that documentation is to what they're familiar with. It's been a challenge for them to collate that in the correct way, and it's been a challenge for test labs to interpret the information the manufacturers have given them as well. There's a group of test labs called the TIC Council, so Testing Inspection and Certification Council. They've organised events where test labs will come together to agree on how to interpret the documentation requests and the test cases. Because if we think back, say, 12 months ago, different test labs would have different interpretations of how to carry out an individual test, which obviously is not beneficial for anybody. We want there to be a harmonised approach. So the test labs have now come together and they've agreed on what their methods are. There has been a lot of feedback as well from manufacturers and from test labs and from notified bodies that it would be helpful to have a structure to the documentation or templates for the documentation. Most test labs will have their own template for how a manufacturer needs to submit it. Elements is no different. We've got interactive decision tree templates to help manufacturers work through that. But some of the feedback that we're giving to developing the next set of standards, so the CRA standards, is that having these templates written in either as an annex or as a separate document would be really useful for manufacturers and test labs alike. But yeah, as things stand right now, I don't have data on how many products are not compliant, but I expect there will be a large number of products on the European marketplace which are not meeting the RED rules, similar to what we saw for PSTI. And again, I think this is just because although we had months to prepare for it, the requirements are very, very new. And we still get manufacturers approaching us, upon last week approached us and said, we've just found out about these requirements, what do we need to do? It's easy for us as test labs and notified bodies to think, well, this is basic stuff and it's been around for months, but that's because we do this day in, day out. Depending on the size of a manufacturer and their product development life cycles, they might think about legislation and harmonised standards once or twice a year. So when things do change, it's easy for us to think everybody should know about this, but in pragmatic terms, not everybody will be aware. And I think, again, the market surveillance bodies will be aware of this, and I expect that they will not be taking particularly strict action at this point in time. But look, as we get towards the back end of 2026 or into 2027, I expect they probably will be doing at that point.
Yeah. Speaking of 2027,
I know where this is going.
Yeah, even though the RED Delegated Act on Cybersecurity has only really recently come into effect, we've got the next thing on the horizon, which is the Cyber Resilience Act. So that's coming. 2027 is a key date. What can we say about that?
So 2027 is the key date, I suppose, for CRA, but there's a couple of other dates we need to talk about as well before we get to that bit. So later in 2026, in September 18th, I think, that's when we have the reporting obligations under the CRA come into effect. So if a manufacturer of a product becomes aware of a significant cybersecurity incident on that product, they have to report it, make that information public. At the point of us recording this video, the reporting platform doesn't exist. So I think a lot of people are worried, what will that look like and how do we know how to use it before that date? Hopefully that will all be sorted out before then. And on the same subject as on the subject of things being a little bit delayed, we actually don't have all the notifying authorities established for CRA yet. So these are the national bodies who appoint the notified bodies. So in the UK, for example, we would have UCAS who would appoint notified bodies. The different notifying authorities in the EU member states haven't all been agreed yet. I think we're still in single digits rather than being at the full 27 that would be needed. But yeah, that 2027 date, December 2027, is when the product requirements come into effect for the CRA. So if you were manufacturing a product with digital elements that connects to any other product with digital elements, then you will need to ensure that meets the CRA from end of 2027. How you do that is a little bit unclear right now. There are harmonised standards being drafted. There are two different groups writing these harmonised standards. So we have ETSI, who wrote the EN 303645 standard that the PSTI regime points to. They are writing a lot of the horizontal standards for CRA for the critical and important products. So there are different categories of products in CRA which are detailed in the annexes as well. ETSI are writing those vertical standards. Sense and Elec are writing a lot of the horizontal standards which will cover all of the other products, I guess, and all the requirements that you would expect to apply across different product categories or industries. Now, those standards will not be ready for a little bit of time just yet. The vertical standards that ETSI are writing are expected to be released throughout 2026, which will give manufacturers, in theory, a year or so to meet those requirements. But the horizontal standards, the deadline for those is not until the end of October 2027, which will obviously only give people a matter of weeks to comply with those requirements before the CRA deadline actually comes into effect in December. Now, that said, it's not panic stations just yet, because the products which don't have a vertical, so all of these other products, there is no obligation to use a harmonised standard. So when we look at the different conformity assessment procedures that are detailed in the CRA, we have, if we just run through the procedures, we've got internal production control, which most people will be familiar with as the self-declaration route. So it doesn't need a notified body, the manufacturer just puts together a declaration. We then have an EU type examination and full quality assurance, both of which need a notified body. And we have a fourth scheme the CRA defines, which is an EUCC scheme. So that's EU Cybersecurity Certification Scheme. Not to be confused with the ECCC or with an EU TEC, which needs a notified body. So another acronym for people to get used to here. Those schemes will apply to different types of products. The European Commission will say which schemes cover which essential requirements for which product type. I'm not sure that's been done for very many of these, if any at all at this point. But the point I was getting to before I went off on that little tangent there is that actually for these products where just the horizontal standards will apply, you can use any of those conformity assessment procedures regardless of whether you've used a harmonised standard or not. So most people would choose to just go through the internal production control route, just issue a declaration. They don't necessarily need to have tested to the harmonised standard. Things are better if you test to the harmonised standard because the manufacturer can get the presumption of conformity. And this is all about shifting the burden of proof. So if you test to a harmonised standard, you gain presumption of conformity, and then effectively the burden is on somebody else to prove that your product isn't compliant, rather than the burden being on the manufacturer to prove that what they've done is sufficient. So using a harmonised standard is always the simpler route, but in practical terms, if the standards aren't published until weeks before the deadline, not everybody will have time to get into a test lab and have the assessment done before then. And I think that's all we really know about the CRA at this point. I realise we're saying that the standards aren't written and the reporting platform doesn't exist and we don't know who the notified bodies are. So it seems like things are quite up in the air. And being honest, that's because they are. But we do still have best part of 2 years for this to all settle down before manufacturers have to comply.
One more curious question about the scope of the Cyber Resilience Act is it talks about connected products or products with digital elements. So that, of course, would include those radio equipment devices that are in the scope of the RED. So does that mean from December 2027, a connected radio equipment would need to comply with both the RED Delegated Act requirements and the CRA?
It's a good question, and one which we do get asked quite a lot by a lot of our customers. And the honest answer is no, you will not have to meet both sets of requirements. We are expecting some text to be published probably in the next few weeks, which will repeal the Red Delegated Act. We expect the text to be published, not enacted. That we expect that it will say from December 2027, this act is now repealed. So manufacturers making a piece of radio equipment will declare against the Red cyber requirements right up until December 2027. Then they'll just strike that off their DOC and start listing the Cyber Resilience Act and just continue to sell the product. And the conformity assessment, the test standards will probably contain a lot of the same mechanisms. We're not expecting that when the CRA comes into force, manufacturers will need to do a complete reassessment and redesign of the product to meet new requirements. Largely, they will be quite similar. And the reason for that is because these cyber standards are all written by different groups and from different angles, but fundamentally they're all trying to answer the question of, is this product cyber secure? And that doesn't change overnight just because the legislation changes. So a secure product will probably meet all the new cyber requirements in the CRA anyway.
That's reassuring. So we've talked about the UK and we've talked about Europe, but how about other places in the world. For example, in the US, they've got a scheme coming related to cybersecurity of equipment and devices as well.
They do, yes. So the FCC have their Cyber Trust Mark scheme, which made a lot of headlines a few months ago and then has just fizzled out a little bit at this point. So the way this scheme works is we have test labs and cyber labelling authority. So this is quite similar to how for radio certification we have a radio test lab and a TCB who actually issues the FCC certificates. One of those labelling authorities, UL, was appointed as the lead administrator, I think they called it. And the idea was that UL would come up with all of the rules and the scheme that sits behind this mark. They presented a draft to the FCC a few months ago, but in the interim, the FCC have opened an investigation into UL over their potential ties to China. Now, obviously, we know the FCC are taking a lot of action at the minute to try to remove Chinese test labs and Chinese influence from the testing and certification process. And that has meant that the scheme is quite up in the air at this point, because the FCC have appointed an administrator who have suggested some rules, but now the FCC are investigating them, and nobody really knows what the future of that scheme will look like, which is a bit disappointing, I suppose, for a lot of the people who were pushing this scheme. Under the Biden administration, this was quite a big scheme that they were pushing, and the head of the FCC at that point was really keen to get this over the line. The new director of the FCC is obviously a little bit less keen for this to press ahead.
That's very interesting. And of course, there are other countries around the world as well that have their own schemes and requirements coming in for cybersecurity, because everyone's talking about cybersecurity these days. So what are some of the key regions that we know about?
Yeah, everybody is talking about this. It's big news everywhere. Europe is definitely ahead of the game in terms of writing the standards and creating the legislation. So we have the RED is already in force, CRA will be in force soon. Obviously the UK's PSTI rules were the first global cybersecurity scheme more mandatory scheme anyway for product compliance. And other regions are borrowing quite heavily from the European standards and the European schemes. So just a few examples that spring to mind. Australia have I think it's called their Cybersecurity Act or something along those lines. And that will become mandatory from, I think, early in 2026, possibly mid-2026. And that is effectively a carbon copy of the UK's PSTI regime. You'll find that quite typically with Australian legislation. It will either borrow from UK, European or North American requirements. Japan have got their own cybersecurity scheme, which they call Japan Cyber Star or JC Star. This is a scheme that's, again, voluntary, but has different levels of applicability, which manufacturers can choose to go for. I think the scheme is already in effect, so people can be applying this label. And this does align quite closely with that same standard, EN 303645. It takes a lot more of the provisions from that standard than the PSTI or the Australian rules do. But if a product meets 303645, that's already gone a long way to meeting these Japanese requirements. And then Taiwan as well have recently announced that they will have mandatory cybersecurity certification for products from, I think, start of 2028, or at least that's the draft date that people are talking about. And this one actually borrows from the 18031 series of standards. So it just takes all three of those standards and puts it into their rules for certain categories of equipment, not just every piece of radio equipment that's on the market in Taiwan. More countries will start having rules brought into effect over the coming months and years, I'm sure. I think a lot of those will borrow heavily from the European standards. Some countries might be waiting to see what the CRA standards look like. So yeah, watch this space. Definitely our advice would be to like and subscribe to these videos so we can get all the latest updates to you as and when they come out. Anything else that's worth talking about for cyber? I guess we've given you a lot of information at this point, and everything else is probably a bit of a unknown, and watch this space.
Yeah, it's a rapidly developing space, and one to keep watching, to keep up to date with how things develop. I mean, we'll certainly be watching it.
We certainly will be, yeah. And look, if you're a manufacturer who needs any help with assessing your products against these cyber requirements, Elements are a test lab, we are a notified body, we have our advisory services team who can help out with creating compliance strategies and test plans. So do reach out to us. I'm sure our contact details will be somewhere in the description for this video, so please do get in touch. And thanks for joining.
Thank you.